So for one of your first assignments, I'm going to be asking you guys to control depth of field. In order to control depth of field, you have to understand a little bit about photography and your cameras. So I'm going to talk to you about equipment and some things to look for. And I brought some actors with me today. What you see in front of you, these are the stars of the show. So let's talk generally about what depth of field is and how we control depth of field. Now, depth of field is the area of an image that is in focus, and I'll put some examples up so you can see some varying depths of field, so you can see that some areas of images are going to be sharp, while other areas of the image are going to be blurred. How we control that is a matter of three factors. The three factors are what's called the aperture. Now the aperture, this is the number one thing, is the opening of the lens. You see how there's a little circle, a diaphragm of the lens. That's a part of the component of the aperture. And we can actually adjust the aperture. Let me try to show you here. I can narrow and increase the size of the aperture with this is actually an old film lens that actually could probably still work on some digital cameras. So you actually have the aperture ring on the lens itself, and you can see if I can get it focused there, the measurements, the aperture measurements. That's what the 22, 10, or excuse me, 16, 11, 8, 5, 6, and 3, 5 are. Now, the thing to remember with aperture, as it said in the lecture, is the lower the number, the wider the aperture. The higher the number, the narrower the aperture. Now let's talk about aperture as it relates to depth of field. The wider your aperture, the narrower your depth of field. And the narrower your aperture, the wider your depth of field, the deeper your depth of field. So more will be in focus. So if we want a shallow depth of field, we want our aperture to be nice and wide. If we want a deep depth of field, we want our aperture to be very narrow. The other factors that control depth of field are the distance from the subject and the focal length. Now, the closer you are to a subject, and I'll have to give you an example in a photograph because this is going to be nice and clear. The closer you are to your subject, the narrower your depth of field will be. The further you are away from your subject, the deeper your depth of field will be. And then the third factor has to do, of course, with the focal length. And let's look at this lens here has the deepest, the longest settings. Here we have a lens that is capable of going from 24 millimeters to 120. So at 24 we're going to have a deeper depth of field. If we go up to 120, we are going to have a shallower depth of field. So we can use a number of different settings to actually control the depth of field. And I'll give you some examples of that. Now I want to talk about how to control your aperture, because many of you are going to have consumer level cameras, what we call. Now what you see here, I have a pro camera and a couple of prosumer cameras, and they're all going to function a little bit differently. This one is a Canon 7D, and on the Canon 7D you can see here on the dial, if I zoom it properly anyway, we have several different settings here. We have the green square is fully automatic on this camera, and then we also have program, the P, and we have TV, AV, and M. If you have a Canon camera, you may have similar settings. Manual, M is for manual. Manual, you would have control of both your aperture and your shutter. Now, for this exercise, the depth of field, you're going to want to control the aperture. AV is what's called aperture priority. You control the aperture, the camera does the rest for you. It will increase and decrease the shutter speed, and in some cases even increase and decrease the ISO in order to accommodate for an appropriate exposure. So you can control the aperture, and I can't get that in focus, can I? You can control the aperture and therefore affect the depth of field. Now, Canons are a little bit trickier, I think, in that respect. I shoot Canon. I think a lot of people might not understand what AV and TV mean. TV is actually our shutter speed. Now, some of you are going to shoot perhaps Nikon. This is a Nikon D70, and if you look at the dial on the Nikon D70, it's a little bit easier to understand because, you know, we have the green camera that says auto over the top of it, and then we have program again, P, and then we have SAM, so S, shutter speed, A, aperture, M, manual. Now, this Nikon happens to have some other features that might be available to some of you who don't have manual aperture shutter priority modes. You see here that it has some icons on the dial there. Those are what are called scene modes, and most of your cameras are going to have scene modes. You see we have a lady with a hat. That's actually the portrait scene mode, and that's actually one of the modes that you're going to use to control depth of field. A portrait typically is going to have a shallow depth of field. So if you want to create a shallow depth of field, even if you're not shooting a portrait, this might be a mode that you can use. We also have, and it's tough to see, if you look closely, and I can't get that focused in there, we have a little mountain, which is our landscape scene. Now, the little mountain scene mode, landscape scene mode, is going to help us as well. This is also going to be a mode that's going to help us control our depth of field. Landscapes, typically, you want everything in focus. So in this landscape scene mode, you're going to have a deep depth of field. The camera is going to do things in such a way that it's going to try to assist you with a different depth of, with a deeper depth of field. And then this last camera is going to be fairly similar to the Nikon. This is a Sony, and this is more of a consumer level camera, even though it is still quite a nice camera. And if you look at the dial on the back of this camera, and again, I'm having a little focus issue here, can't focus as closely as I'd like, I apologize for that. You can see it's actually pretty similar to the Nikon. It has the manual, aperture priority, shutter priority, the green camera for automatic, and then it has a little person for portrait, a little landscape for landscape scene mode, and then a couple of other scene modes as well. So you're going to have to read your manual and learn about your scene modes. And of course, do contact me if you have difficulty. And of course, the scene modes are going to help you. Controlling your aperture is going to help you. But that's only one thing. The aperture is only one factor that's going to control your depth of field. Don't forget that distance to your subject and focal length also produces wider and deeper depth of fields. So if you want to create narrower and deeper depths of fields. If you want to create a shallow depth of field, you can get closer to your subject. Use a longer focal length. If you want to have a deeper depth of field, you can back away from your subject or decrease your focal length. So a number of factors that we can use to control our depth of field.